present about fathers and parental leave, and I will try to approach the question of why or why not fathers use the parental leave from the Swedish perspective, a country, of course, where fathers are using quite a lot of leave. But I will try to focus on the variation of parental leave use and in connection to the labor market collective agreements, which is a subject that is not as common to bring up as one would think. This is about top-ups during the leave, and it has to do with the structure of the labor market. It has increased recently in Sweden very much, these kind of top-ups you get during the parental leave. And it's based on agreements between the trade union and the employers' organization. But I think one reason why it's not so well talked about, or not so much talked about, is actually because it is often confusing and it's a complicated system. But I will try to bring this through. That's my aim. Okay. So I will talk about. I will start with a basic picture of Sweden. I will talk a bit about how the parental leave look, how the labor market looks, and then the collective agreements. And I will say something about why I think that the collective agreements are important, their scope, and how much they do affect parents that are on leave. I will focus on the example of parental leave, and I will tell you about our study that is focusing on the first 10 years of 2000, when it was this big expansion. And of course, I will talk about the results and conclude from that. But first, to give you a little bit of a picture of Sweden, Swedish parental leave is 8 months to each parent. It's 6.5 months with good payment. There are income replacement, and a 1.5 month with a lower payment. If you haven't worked before, you have a very low payment throughout the system, throughout the time. It's often not described as this. It's often described as having 16 months of leave together, but it is an individual insurance. You have the right as a parent to give some of your days to the other parent. So you can, as a father, say, or as a mother, you can give 5 months out of your 8 months to the other parent, but 3 months you have to keep for yourself. If you don't use it, it will be forfeited. And this is what we normally call the daddy months and the mommy month. But really, the system is not set up as a common system. It's set up as an individual system. I also should point out that there's a large flexibility in how you can use this. You can use the leave up to the child is 12 years old. You can also combine it with unpaid leave if you want to. So this doesn't really mean that you are always home 8 months each parent. And you can use it at the same time together. And there's a lot of variation in how you use it. So we don't really know how long people are home from this. But this shows you the share of fathers' leave use from the insurance was instituted or introduced in 1974 up to today. And today, fathers use about 30% of all leave used. This is a simplification. This is taking all the leave use that is used in a year and just dividing it up into men and women, and then we get these numbers. But this, as said, I'll say it again, that you can also use unpaid leave, and there's a lot of flexibility. So this doesn't really mean that the fathers are home for 30% of the time with the children. We still have a fair number of fathers that are not using any leave at all. If we look at the first 2 years, there's about 25% of the fathers that haven't used any leave during the first 2 years. Yeah, what the labor market looks like. What one refers to then is something, it's often related to the strong trade unions that organize a large share of the workers and the employees at the labor market. One often talks about a wage structure that is with relatively small differences between different jobs, and that we have a very even development over time. We talk about the strong position of the workers that is really regulated through the strong unions. there's a strong security. It's really hard to fire someone in Sweden, and if you are fired, you should have good economic security afterwards. I think I put the question mark there because I think this is really changing quite a lot over time. But one major goal of the labor market policy has been to keep the unemployment very low. And I mentioned this as I think it's characteristic here is that the trade union and the employers organizations, they are both strong, and they are then equally strong, more or less. So there's a lot of negotiation. This is often described as a collaboration in Sweden, actually. They're centrally organized, and there's a lot of agreements that happens on a central level. Another important factor here is that we have a very comparatively high female labor force participation, and we've had so for a long time. But at the same time, the labor market is really gender segregated. So women typically work in care sector and education, while men work in more industrial sector, like everywhere. But there's a very sharp divide between the private and the public sector too, where men are more dominating the private sector. And of course, when this trade union and employers organization are making deals about wage development and also the collective agreement, this is really going to affect the different parts of the labor market differently, and men and women differently, as the labor market is so gender segregated. Some very short words about the welfare state that I think you were aware of, but anyway, to repeat it because it has bearing on the whole context. Some part of the Swedish welfare state is based on residence, and then it's free for everyone. But a very large part is also based on work. So the work-related benefits are actually important. And those benefits you get, and you get them quite well paid if you have worked. But if you haven't worked, you get a very low benefit, or a very, very, very low standard of living. So it really matters that you have worked before. So to have these large differences between income-related benefits and for those ones who haven't worked, that's been very important in Sweden. And it's been important to protect the workforce, but also to work as an incentive to work. And especially one reason here is to work before you become a parent. You know all this, but the important thing here that it's important to work, but also where you work. And where you work, that's where the collective agreements come in. So what are really the collective agreements? So the collective agreements, they're forged contracts between the unions and employers. They decide primarily about the wage development in your sector, but also about other benefits. So for example, they decide about work conditions, holidays, and parental leave, as I will come into. And they do cover everyone employed in the sector. So even if you're not a member of the union, you are going to be affected by this. They're binding agreements, and they are then in addition to the labor law and the national social security. You can call this industrial relations. That is, I think you can call it industrial relation. Again, I want you to make note that if you negotiate for a high wage, you might have lower other benefits. So you might negotiate differently in different unions here. But over time, these agreements have become more and more important. So today they cover 90% of the workforce, but there are almost 700 different agreements with different kind of setups. They're updated yearly in negotiations then. So they're really hard to keep track of, actually. There's no register that shows us this, what's the agreement, unless they're changing yearly. There's no way to really see what's happening. You need to collect that data yourself. So it's hard to get an overview over the agreements, I would say. But they have expanded and they've become more generous, which means that they are deciding more about the work conditions. But who is it then that are not covered by the agreements? Well, I said 90% are covered by the agreements, but the ones not covered are the typically new industries, the gig economy, foreign companies, but also small employers like cafe owners or self-employed people and so on that cannot afford the collective agreements. This was from a series this winter. A typical sector then that's not included in the collective agreements are the bicycle couriers, who of course had a terrible situation this very snowy winter in Sweden. And there was a report on how to try to get better conditions for them. And of course the union is working to get everyone collective agreements, but yeah, it's not always happening. But I want to emphasize that it is important. We don't have, for example, minimum wages in Sweden. So if you don't have a collective agreement, you might be paid next to nothing, because there's not, and that's not against the law in any kind of way. So the collective agreements are really important to your wage and all the conditions you have during your work. So how much does this matter then? Well, it's in addition to the social security, definitely. With the example of the parental leave, but this also is the same for the sick leave and unemployment, is you get normally 77.6% of the income you had before you're using it, up to a ceiling. But this ceiling is set at different levels, and it's adjusted yearly. The ceiling at the moment, or the last 30 years, is actually falling behind quite a lot. So more and more are affected by the extra benefits you get during your parental leave if you have a good collective agreement. And I will give you an example here from a parental leave. In this example, someone has the wage of 35,000, which is a very common, it's a normal wage for someone who's a nurse or a civil servant or maybe a school teacher. We say this person have a collective agreement, which means that she or he gets extra benefits during the parental leave. A common agreement is that you get 10% extra for everything under the ceiling, and then that you get 90% over the ceiling. And in this example, you see that this monthly will be 9,000 crowns difference for this person. So this is a lot. It really differs a lot whether you have a good agreements or not. And I will also show you how many this affects. This is taken from a report from the Swedish Social Insurance Agency, and it shows you the share of the workforce that is affected by the ceiling. It shows you, well, it's the women that are the light, for parental leave, most interesting for parental leave, it's the women are the dotted light green and the men are the full line, the light green. We see that 29% of the men, they hit the ceiling, and about 16% hit the ceiling out of women today. The other lines are for the sick leave, and then you can see that's a lower base. The ceiling is lower for that, so even more people are hitting the ceiling. So these are really high numbers. It really questions the universality of the system, I would say. Okay, so how does then the collective agreement during parental leave look? Well, the state sector has the best situation. Already 25 years ago, the state sector had good collective agreements giving you, while you're on parental leave, 10% extra under the ceiling and then 90% for above the ceiling to however high income you have. The municipal sector, they had some coverage, but not for such a long time. Over the first 10 years of 2000, they were the time that you get these extra benefits were increasing, but also especially this 10% below the ceiling was increasing quite a lot. For the private sector, it's a little harder to say because there's been so much variation, or still is so much variation within this sector. It varies by the type of industry, by white and blue colors, and also in some agreements it varies by men and women actually. So there's a large variation, but to say something really general here is that the typically male jobs, they are getting better agreements during this time, whereas the women already had somewhat good agreements, but especially men, the male sectors are getting better during the first 10 years of 2000. Of course, this is really important to the gender equality. And remember, I said with the wage development, it's always a negotiation to have good collective agreements or to have a good wage development. And we still have quite large income differences between men and women in Sweden. Okay, but now I hope that you're convinced that the collective agreements are important, and it's important where you work. I also hope that you have with you that the things that, or the developments in the beginning of the 2000s were mainly in the municipal, but mainly in the private sectors. They caught up with the state sector that already had good agreements before that. So if you talk about comparatively parental leave policy research, it's often considered that a well-paid or sufficient economic compensation is what's needed for men and women to use the parental leave, and especially for men to use the leave. Sometimes this limit is put at 66%, but sometimes it's higher than that. And I know, for example, Anna Kurowska, som is here, she has stated that it's important that it should be close to 100% really for men to use the leave. We also know that the ceiling is important. And actually, I want to mention a study that I did myself early from the beginning of the 90s, when we didn't have these agreements. And then we saw really clearly that the higher income men had, the more leave they used up to the ceiling. Then it was a complete stop. So it was increasing up to that ceiling, and then it was a stop. As we will see, this has changed over time. That was data then from the beginning of the 90s. But it's also important to point out that it's difficult to know about these top-ups also internationally. They're often considered as commercially sensitive and not available for public information. And also to do this comparatively would be very difficult, because the structure of the top-ups is really different in different countries, but also, as we see in the case of Sweden, in different sectors. So the results from a study looking at this would help us to discuss the effectiveness of employer strategies to create different behaviors, such as leave use. It will say something about the pros and cons of diversified benefits. That looks different than for different parents in this case. And this will say something about the universalism of the Swedish family policy and how important the compensation level is. There's a perception that fathers in particular are affected by this economic benefits that they are getting. So the opportunity cost for childcare is really perceived as gendered here. So the possibility to opt out for men if they don't get a good benefit is still there also in Sweden. Lastly, I just want to say that it might also be that these benefits mean something more than just economic benefits. They might actually signal that it's okay to take leave, or it's even encouraged to take leave. So they might have more value than just economic value. Okay, so what do we expect then that had happened during this time? Well, our main expectation is that the improved collective agreements, they are leading to that fathers are using more leave during this time, and then that the ones that were most affected are the ones using most leave. So first of all, the ones we saw most of the increases in collective agreements in the private sector. So we are expecting that the men's leave are increasing more in the private sector than in the state and municipality sectors. We see that it's going to be more important with the collective agreement if you have an income over the ceiling. So we think that they matter more. We see more of an increase in men's leave for the ones with high income compared to the ones with low income. And then we think that among the high income earners, that it has been mostly beneficial in the private sectors. So we're expecting that the private sector's high income fathers are increasing their leave most. Lastly, if we only look at the private sectors as such, the ones with high incomes are the ones that are getting much more better situations. So we're thinking that within the private sector, we're expecting that the ones with high income are the ones that are increasing their leave the most. So these are our expectations, and we're not going to be right on all of them. I will warn you beforehand. But we're using data from the Swedish National Population Register. So these are administrative registers of parental leave use. We have sector of employment, as well as information about income and education, and we can link parents and children over time. So what we do is that we compare the trend of fathers' parental leave use, or their take-up of leave, across time, starting with the fathers that had a child in December, January of 1999-2000, and up to every year to 10 years after that. We often talk about the good, the merits of the Swedish register data, but one actually problem in this case is that it's annual data. So if we take these children that are born just by the change of the year, we can follow them for the same time for parental leave, because the parental leave value is annual. If we would have included other children or parents to other children, they would not have the same time to use the leave. So this is a bit of a problem, but it also means a bit of a fuzziness in the measure here. We look at cases where we have two parents. We follow them for 2 years, so you have 2 years to use the parental leave. We only look at the firstborn to not confuse it with parental leave for other children. If you have another child within the 2 years, we are excluding those fathers. We only look at the ones that are employed, as we are interested in the collective agreement in this case. So we're excluding the ones without income. In this study, we don't look at mothers at all. And I think this is a fair critique to the study, that we're looking at fathers' leave use on its own. But to remind you, this is it's not really a zero-sum game between fathers and mothers' parental leave, but it's an individual insurance. So I still think it's a problem that we're not considering mothers, but it's not as big of a problem as it can be thought of as being, or that it might be in other countries where you have a leave that goes to the parents together. Well, we are using linear probability models to estimate the probability first of using any leave at all compared to not using any leave for the first 2 years. And then we're using OLS regressions to estimate the number of days that the father is taking. And this, then we're only looking at the fathers that are using any leave at all for the second part of the model. So we're doing 2 sets of models. First, whether you use any leave, and then the number of days you're using. And then to capture the change over time, we use interactions between our main variables and the year variable. So we're looking at the 3 sectors, and we're looking at these 10 years that 11 years that I mentioned already. And we have a number of controls here that are really the common controls that we can have in this data. I want to show you first descriptively how this look, and then I will start by sector. This is the share of fathers using any leave for the first 2 years, and I've done this then for the first and the last year. Of course, you could have done this with a trend too, and it is a trend over this time, but to make it simple, I did take the first and the last year. And as you can see, it's between 75 and 90% of all fathers using leave in these 3 sectors. Actually, over this time, it's the municipal sector that the share of fathers using the leave is increasing the most. If we instead look at the number of days, we see that there's a marked increase, and in 2010, fathers are using about 100 days. The main increase, or the largest increase here, is among state fathers employed in the state sectors that are increasing their leave use the most, the number of days the most. If you instead look at income, there's a marked increase. Actually, the ones that are increasing the share of users the most are the ones with the lowest income, but you can also see that they also had a very low share of users in the beginning of this period. And when we look at the number of days, it's actually the ones above the ceiling that are increasing the number of days used the most. Okay, so I will show you models where we're testing these interactions with year and the variable we're interested in. So all models are including control variables, the ones that I mentioned, but I'm not showing those for simplicity. I cut them out of the model. So the first column here, we're looking at any use at all, and the second column, it's the number of days used. And in this first set of models, we see clearly that parental leave take-up has increased in general across this period, and we see this in the year variable. I also added the squared year variable to see whether there was a trend over time. But we can, in the second column, see that on average, it's almost increasing. The father's leave use is almost increasing by 6 days per year. But the increase is kind of leveling off a little bit in the end of the period. But both the share of fathers and the number of days is increasing during this time. We also see that the state sectors are using more days and the municipal sector are using more days compared to the private sector that are here the reference category. So as top-ups expanded most in the private sector, we expected this to change most for the private sector. But here we see the interaction terms that indicates that the change over time by sector there's no significant change over time here. So it's not changing more in the state sector or in the municipality sector compared to the private sector. So the only thing we see actually is that there's a slightly larger increase in number of days for the state sector over this time. But in general, we can't really distinguish a clear difference between the private sectors and the other ones. And certainly the private sector is not increasing more than the other sectors. So our first expectation is not met here. Then we're looking at income in the second model. And in general, you can see that the ones you see that the fathers that have an income above the ceiling, they are less likely to use the leave, and they're also using fewer days over the whole period. But if we're looking at the interaction term here, we can see that the share of users is increasing more among the ones above the ceiling, and it's increasing with more days as well. So it's a faster increase among fathers above the ceiling. So this is what we expected, that fathers with the income above the ceiling are increasing more, and this is also what we found here. Then we're turning to only the ones with high income. So among the ones that had a high income above the ceiling, do we see a difference between the different sectors here? So in this model, I've only included the ones that have income above the ceiling. So the sample is much smaller here. It's only high income fathers. But what we see here in the interaction is no effect as well. So among the fathers above the ceiling, there's no difference between whether you're working in the state sector or municipal sector or in the private sectors. They seem to increase as much, all of them, in this comparison. And lastly, I'm turning to the ones in the private sectors, as I wanted to compare the ones with low income and high income within the private sectors. And we were expecting that the ones with high income in the private sectors were increasing more than the ones with low income. And this is actually what we do find in the interaction term here. So the ones within the private sectors, fathers with an income above the ceiling are increasing their leave use more, both in share of uses and in number of days during this time. We checked the same thing for the municipal sector and the state sectors, and we did not find this strong difference between above and below the ceiling in these sectors. I did a bunch of sensitivity analysis that I won't talk about now, but if you ask, we'll talk about them. But to summarize the results, what we find is that actually men's leave do not increase more in the private sector than it does in the other two sectors. However, men's leave increase most for men with high income during this time. It doesn't increase more among the high income users in the private sector compared to the other sectors. But if we only look at the private sectors, it's really the high income fathers that are increasing their leave use most. So in sum, we can say here that income is surely much more important than sector is, especially though within the private sectors. We have a very crude measure in 3 sectors here, and we think that we can measure this more carefully or more detailed in the future with better data, more nuanced data. And we think that we might get a more nuanced answer then. But this is the first step. And we think that the results indicate an increase really in the divide in leave use between fathers with high and low incomes. So the earlier pattern that I told you about, where we had a clear stop at the ceiling, so fathers above the ceiling were not increasing the leave use most, that's now changed. So instead it's the high income fathers that are developing and increasing the leave use the most, and might be seen as the forerunners today. They were not before. But perhaps we don't see any difference between sectors as the information flows and behavior change more gradually than we can catch here. If this is the case, or then also other factors might be important, such as what kind of work tasks you have, workplace norm and cultures. And these factors, of course, these mediating factors might also be changed over time. But this might take time, and that's the reason why we do see more change within the state sector now than the other sectors, because they had their agreement some 25 years ago, and now we're seeing the effect of that. That's a possible explanation, that there's a lag in the effect, and we're seeing, therefore, the effect now for the state sector. But the combination of occupational and state involvement benefits that we do see in a country like Sweden here, that seems to benefit this, or to lead, not benefit, but it seems to lead to more dualization on the labor market. So the collective agreements are increasing their role and their power as the statutory parental leave is weakening and becoming less important. Then, of course, the collective agreements are becoming more important. So we are here in this study investigating an insider benefit of top-ups and so on. But of course, the outsiders, the ones that don't get these collective agreements at all, the ones that are not working or temporary working or working in bad jobs or in self-employment and so on, they are receiving a much lower benefit. So they become even more marginalized when we compare to these good benefits that we now have within the labor market. So a stable attachment and a position in the labor market is becoming more important. And this, of course, this difference then between insider and outsider is contributing to this enduring inequality in leave use for fathers. So this is really, I think what we're showing here is the downside of not having a truly universal available financial support for fathers, but also for mothers to take leave use. So in a way, what I'm showing here, or one way of interpreting it, is that this is a threat to universality of the Swedish system. Okay, thank you very much.